On my birthday, my family gave me a special necklace. They all laughed. It's plastic, just like your life choices. My aunt whispered, "You'll never be one of us." I smiled, pulled out a velvet box, and said, "Then you'll love this even more." The gasps were priceless. For years, I was treated as the failure of my prestigious family. On my 35th birthday, they pulled a cruel prank, giving me a plastic necklace and laughing at my expense. What they didn't know was that I had been quietly preparing for this moment for years. That night, after their taunts, I handed my mother a velvet box containing documents that revealed I had legally taken over the family business. Their reaction was unforgettable. Now, I'm wondering, where do I go from here? Did I go too far, or was I right to finally stand up for myself? Last month, I turned 35. My name's Camille, and my family, the Prestons, are a long-standing name in Mating, Connecticut. You know the type: old houses, old money, and even older expectations. Being a Preston came with rules: go into the family business, marry someone appropriate, maintain appearances at all costs. I broke those rules a long time ago. Instead of taking my place in the family's chain of antique stores across New England, I became a freelance writer. Not exactly the golden path they'd carved out for me. To them, I was wasting my life on pipe dreams, as my mother liked to say. Still, despite the simmering tension, I kept showing up for the big family events: birthdays, holidays, funerals, more out of a sense of duty than desire. So when my mother called and invited me to a special family dinner for my birthday at Water's Edge Resort, I said yes. I guess a small part of me still hoped maybe this year would be different. When I arrived, everyone was already there. My mother, Diane, was sitting upright and pristine in a navy dress. My father, Vincent, barely glanced up from his drink. My brother, Bryce, gave me a nod, the bare minimum. My Aunt Judith, with her signature fake smile. My cousins Peter and Simone, smirking before I even took my seat. And Ivy, Aunt Judith's daughter, who somehow managed to look down her nose at me while complimenting my dress. I found an empty chair between Peter and Aunt Judith. No one offered to move or make space. The waiter had to come over twice before I managed to get a glass of water. Dinner was a blur of conversations that barely included me. Bryce bragged about his promotion in his father-in-law's company. Ivy talked about her pregnancy, dropping hints that the baby shower would be immediate family only. Peter droned on about renovations to his new vacation home. No one asked what I was working on or how my writing was going. When I tried to mention it, how one of my articles had been picked up nationally, the conversation shifted so quickly it was like I hadn't spoken at all. By the time dessert came, I was numb. I was ready to leave. But then, just as the melting cake arrived, my mother cleared her throat. "We have a little something for you," she said, her voice sweet in that artificial way that made my stomach knot up. Bryce reached under the table and pulled out a small, rectangular box. It looked like jewelry packaging, the kind that usually held something elegant, meaningful. I hesitated for half a second, then opened it. Inside was a necklace. But not a beautiful piece of jewelry. No gold, no silver. It was plastic, bright, tacky, something a child might make at a summer camp. There was a beat of silence, and then the laughter started. "It's plastic," Ivy giggled, dabbing her mouth with her napkin like it was the funniest thing she'd ever seen. "Just like your life choices." Peter leaned in closer and muttered, "Thought it was a good match." The others laughed louder. Even my mother allowed herself a smirk, sipping her wine like she'd just pulled off the greatest trick. For a moment, I just stared at them. Every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every miserable Christmas dinner flashed through my mind. Years of being belittled, dismissed, ignored. Then Aunt Judith leaned over, her breath hot with the wine she'd been drinking all night, and whispered, "You'll never be one of us, Camille." And that was it. I smiled. Slowly. Not because I found it funny, but because they had no idea what was coming. Without saying a word, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, velvet-covered box. I placed it right in front of my mother. Since you went to the trouble, I said calmly, I thought I'd bring a gift too. The laughter died instantly. My mother narrowed her eyes but opened the box. Inside wasn't jewelry. It was a stack of papers, neatly arranged, the top page showing my grandfather's signature, and mine. They scanned the pages in confusion. Until the realization hit. I'd used my inheritance from my grandfather, the only Preston who ever believed in me, and quietly bought controlling interest in Preston Antiques. Over the years, I'd watched as they squabbled, as they diluted their shares, mortgaging them off for quick cash or bad investments. I'd bought through shell companies. Hired lawyers. Set everything up piece by piece. And now? I owned the family business. Outright. The table erupted. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Bryce slammed his fist onto the table, causing silverware to jump. Aunt Judith gasped so loudly it echoed off the walls. Ivy looked like she was about to cry. You manipulated us, my mother snapped, rising from her chair. You didn't even notice, I replied, voice steady. You won't get away with this. Bryce shouted. I shrugged. You already signed everything over. You were too busy laughing at me to read the fine print. Peter stood up, knocking over his chair. You won't get a dime out of us. I stared at him. I don't need a dime from you. The waiter, who had been hovering nearby awkwardly, retreated to the kitchen. Other guests in the restaurant were starting to stare. I slid the plastic necklace back across the table toward them. Thanks for this, I said quietly. It's a good reminder. And with that, I turned and walked out. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I let the door swing shut behind me, their stunned faces burned into my memory. Outside, the air smelled sharp and clean, like the start of a storm. I took a deep breath, feeling lighter than I had in years. The drive home was a blur, headlights and highway signs flashing past. My phone buzzed constantly, calls from Bryce, from my mother, even from Ivy. I ignored every one of them. When I got home, I turned off my phone. Made a cup of tea. Sat on my tiny second-hand couch and just existed. For once, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was freedom. The next morning, I woke up to a dozen voicemails. I didn't listen to any of them. Their anger, their confusion, none of it mattered anymore. I made coffee, sat by the window, and watched the early sun roll in over the city. For the first time in years, my future felt wide open, like a road stretching ahead without anyone trying to steer me off it. By noon, the emails started. Bryce sent the first one, a furious message accusing me of stealing the family's legacy. He CC'd my parents and Aunt Judith, as if somehow ganging up on me digitally would change the facts. That was followed by a formal letter from a law firm in New Haven. They were threatening legal action unless I relinquished control of Preston Antiques back to the family. I read the letter once, set it down, and smiled a little to myself. I wasn't stupid. I had spent 2 years preparing for this, consulting quietly with my own attorneys. Every transaction, every acquisition, had been vetted and double-checked. There was nothing illegal about it. They had given it up willingly, too distracted by greed, ego, and underestimating me to realize what they were signing away. Still, part of me wasn't surprised by their desperation. People like them don't lose gracefully. I forwarded the letter to my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Andrea who had handled all the acquisitions. Her response was short. They have no case. Let them waste their money trying. So I let them. The next few weeks were tense. There were calls from old family friends, uncomfortable emails from former business partners who suddenly weren't sure where their loyalties should lie. Rumors circulated around S-matting that I had tricked my dying grandfather, or that I had manipulated the family when they were vulnerable. None of it touched me. In the meantime, I began reshaping the business. I visited every Preston Antiques location personally. Some were in rough shape, outdated, cluttered, full of items that hadn't sold in decades. The employees, many of whom had been treated terribly under my family's management, were understandably wary of me. But I didn't fire them. Instead, I listened. I spent hours in dusty backrooms, talking to clerks who knew the inventory better than any Preston ever had. I asked them what they needed, what customers complained about, what they wished the stores could be. Slowly, carefully, I rebuilt. The stores were redesigned with clean lines, better lighting, better layouts. We introduced consignment for local artists and vintage sellers, breathing fresh life into the spaces. We started holding community events, book readings, small art shows, antique appraisal days that pulled curious crowds. Sales started creeping up almost immediately. The rebrand wasn't just about business. It was personal. It was about creating something I could be proud of, something real, not the rotting legacy the Prestons had clung to like a security blanket. Still, even as the stores flourished, the fallout at home continued. My mother tried to freeze me out, pretending I didn't exist at charity functions and local gatherings. Ivy spread half-truths among her friends, painting me as a greedy traitor. Bryce even showed up at my apartment once, pounding on the door and demanding to talk like family. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called security and watched from my window as he was quietly escorted off the property. Some nights, when it was quiet and the world slowed down, I wondered if I had gone too far. Had I been cruel? Vindictive? Had I become the very thing I hated? But the answer always came, clear and steady, no. What I had done wasn't cruelty. It was survival. They had spent decades cutting me down, laughing behind my back, making sure I knew my place. The necklace had been the final blow, a public, deliberate humiliation meant to remind me that I would never be good enough. And yet here I was, building something from the ashes they left behind. Life, I realized, wasn't about getting revenge. It was about finally stepping into the light and refusing to apologize for it. One afternoon, about 3 months after the birthday dinner, I received an invitation in the mail. A wedding. Ivy was getting married, a lavish affair planned for the Esmatting Yacht Club, complete with a black tie dress code and a strictly immediate family after-party. The invitation was clearly sent as an afterthought, probably out of obligation. I put it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. There was a time, not long ago, when I would have agonized over it. Worried about what attending, or not attending, would say about me. But now? I tore the invitation in half and dropped it in the trash without a second thought. 2 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail, like I always did now. Later, listening to the message, I recognized the voice instantly, Aunt Judith. Her words were stiff, brittle. "Camille, dear, we've been talking, and we think it might be good to meet. Clear the air. We're still family, after all." I deleted the message before she even finished speaking. Family wasn't about blood, I realized. It was about respect. About love, about kindness. Things the Prestons had never shown me, and never would. And I didn't owe them anything. Weeks passed, and the calls and messages from my family slowed to a trickle. Not because they had forgiven or forgotten, but because they realized something that perhaps hurt them even more than losing the business. I wasn't playing anymore. I wasn't dancing around their moods, begging for scraps of affection or approval. I wasn't participating in the performance. I was out. And I was fine. Better than fine. I was thriving. I had moved into a better apartment, nothing extravagant, but it had wide windows, sun that poured across the hardwood floors in the mornings, and a little balcony where I could drink coffee and listen to the city waking up. Preston antiques had, by some small miracle, become popular. Young couples looking for unique wedding gifts, interior designers searching for statement pieces, even local historians, they were all finding their way into the stores. We were even planning to open a new location in Providence, something the family had talked about for years but never managed to pull off. I should have been happy. And I was, mostly. But sometimes, in the quieter moments, I felt the familiar ache. The one that asked ugly, vulnerable questions: why wasn't I ever enough for them? Why did being myself mean losing them completely? I tried not to dwell. Therapy helped. So did work. So did long walks by the river, and late nights on the phone with friends who had slowly filled the gaps where family should have been. Still, when the news came, it hit me harder than I expected. Ivy's wedding was a disaster. Not the picturesque, perfect day she had spent months bragging about. No, it was messy. Chaotic. Painful. I didn't get the full story all at once. It came in pieces, through old acquaintances and mutual friends I hadn't realized still kept tabs on me. Apparently, the night before the wedding, Bryce got drunk and picked a fight with the groom at the rehearsal dinner. Something about family honor, about how the Prestons were being humiliated and replaced. At the wedding itself, my mother caused a scene. She stood up during the reception and delivered a rambling, wine-soaked speech about loyalty, betrayal, and how some people no names mentioned, but everyone knew had turned their backs on everything the Prestons stood for. By the end of the night, half the guests had left early. The groom's family was furious. Ivy cried in the bathroom for an hour while Aunt Judith tried to do damage control. And I wasn't there for any of it. I spent that weekend curled up on my couch with a good book, a plate of takeout, and no regrets. But still, when I heard about the fallout, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. It didn't have to be this way. They could have chosen differently. They didn't. A few days after the wedding, another message arrived. This time from Peter. His voice was tight, forced casualness barely covering the anger underneath. Camille. Look, maybe we could meet for coffee. Just talk. I think we're all a little hurt. Maybe you could help fix some of this. Fix. The word rolled around in my mind for hours after I deleted the message. That was the pattern, wasn't it? They broke it, and I was supposed to fix it. They insulted, belittled, discarded, and I was supposed to mend, forgive, forget. Not anymore. It was around this time that something unexpected happened. Something small, but strangely meaningful. One of the older employees at the S-matting store, Mrs. Laverty, who had worked under my family for almost 30 years, came into my office after hours. She was a thin woman with silver hair always pinned up in a bun and a way of carrying herself like she weighed 100 pounds more than she did, years of being overlooked, undervalued. I thought she was coming to give notice. Instead, she sat down across from me, folded her hands carefully, and said, "I just wanted to say, thank you. It's been better working here since you took over." I blinked, caught completely off guard. "You actually listen," she said, her voice rough with age and emotion. "You treat us like people, not burdens." It wasn't a grand moment. There were no trumpets or applause. Just a tired woman offering honest gratitude. But it stayed with me. Maybe, I thought, it wasn't about fixing what had been broken with my family. Maybe it was about building something new. Something that deserved to exist. I threw myself even harder into the work. We launched a scholarship fund in my grandfather's name, offering grants to young artists and writers who couldn't afford college tuition. We expanded our antique restoration services and partnered with local history museums for special exhibits. Each small success felt like stitching up a piece of myself I hadn't realized was still bleeding. And then, just when the dust was finally settling, Bryce did something that almost pulled me back in. Bryce's next move wasn't surprising. He tried to set up a meeting, officially through a mediator. The letter arrived in a thick envelope, formal and full of legal jargon, but the meaning was simple. Bryce wanted to resolve disputes and negotiate a fair return of family assets. In short, he wanted his power back. He was hoping that if he dressed it up in enough polite language, I might feel guilty, or nostalgic, or simply overwhelmed enough to hand it over. I didn't. I sat in the conference room at my lawyer's office, across from him and his lawyer, as they tried to spin a story where I was the villain, hoarding what rightfully belonged to the Prestons. Bryce wore an expensive suit, but it didn't hide the cracks. His hand shook slightly when he flipped through the documents. His face was red, his voice rising whenever he thought I wasn't reacting properly. "You've made your point, Camille," he said finally, when he realized their arguments weren't landing. "You won. You proved whatever you needed to prove. Now be reasonable." I looked at him for a long time. This was my brother, the one who had laughed the hardest the night they gave me the plastic necklace. The one who had made sure I always felt like an outsider at every family gathering. The one who once told me, to my face, that I was an embarrassment. Be reasonable? I smiled politely. "I am being reasonable," I said. "I could liquidate everything. I could sell the whole company to outside investors tomorrow and walk away. But I haven't." Bryce opened his mouth, but I kept going, my voice calm and clear. "I've rebuilt it. I've saved what you all were too arrogant to protect. It's thriving because of me, not because of some dusty family name. You didn't want me when I was struggling. You don't get to have me, or what I built, now that it's successful." The mediator cleared his throat awkwardly. Bryce looked like he wanted to flip the table, but he managed to gather his things with a jerky movement and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. I stayed seated, breathing evenly, until his footsteps faded down the hall. Andrea, my lawyer, gave me a small nod across the table. Silent approval. It was done. Over the next few months, the family tried to apply pressure in other ways, rumors about the business being taken over by outsiders, whispers in town about how I betrayed them. But the louder they spoke, the less people listened. Because the truth was obvious now. Preston Antiques was booming. Under my leadership, the brand was modern, welcoming, successful. Customers loved it. The local newspapers ran features praising the bold new direction and the visionary revival of a beloved New England institution. Not once did my family's name come up in those articles. Eventually, the rumor stopped. The town moved on. And so did I. A year later, almost to the day, I walked into one of our stores, the original flagship location in Esmating. It had just finished renovations. Fresh paint, open windows, clean displays. The old heavy velvet curtains were gone, replaced by sunlight and space. Near the front entrance, we had set up a small exhibit, a tribute to the store's history. Photos of my grandfather, smiling and proud. Early newspaper clippings. Vintage store signs. And, tucked into a small glass display case, right near the front, one last item. The plastic necklace. I'd kept it. Not out of sentimentality. Not because I wanted to remember the hurt. But because it was a reminder of who I was, and who I would never be again. Visitors sometimes asked about it, curious why a childish-looking necklace was displayed alongside such polished artifacts. The store managers had a standard answer: it's a symbol of transformation. And they were right. Because I had taken what was meant to humiliate me, and built an empire around it. On my 36th birthday, I threw a small celebration. Not a giant party. Not a desperate family dinner. Just friends, real friends, people who saw me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. There was laughter, music, a warm breeze rolling in from the water. At one point, Marisol, one of my closest friends, handed me a small box. "Thought you'd appreciate this," she said with a wink. I opened it, and laughed. Inside was a necklace made of bright, gaudy plastic beads. I slipped it on without hesitation, laughing so hard my sides hurt. Because now, the joke wasn't on me. It never had been. In the end, I didn't destroy the Prestons. I didn't need to. They destroyed themselves, with their arrogance, their cruelty, their refusal to see the world changing around them. All I did was stop playing their game, and start winning at mine. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need their approval. I didn't even want it. I had something far better, myself. Whole. Unapologetic. Free.